Sibelius's Violin Concerto is one of the best loved classics of the violin concerto repertory, and not surprisingly, it's an amazing piece. Passionate, wonderfully constructed, incredibly gripping all the way through, and full of those marvelous tunes that Sibelius knew how to create. But it's interesting, isn't it? Some great works are definitely not produced without pain, and there was a lot of pain in this case. Sibelius, you look at photographs of him, particularly in his later years, and he looks like this magnificent Nordic titan. His music often seems so strong, so concentrated, so unsentimental, so focused that you could imagine it goes with the picture of Sibelius as an extremely self-controlled man. But as a man, he was quite different. He was a needy, womanizing alcoholic. And at the time he wrote the Violin Concerto, his alcoholism was at its worst. Apparently, he sketched out the slow movement during a 3-day hangover, which is pretty terrifying. But then Finns are well known for their extraordinary tolerance of alcohol. I think it has something to do with surviving those long, dark winters. Why was this such a painful task? Well, partly because there was something deeply personal here for Sibelius. Originally, he hadn't wanted to be a composer. He wanted to be a virtuoso violinist. And actually, he was clearly very good. His teachers were rather impressed, and one of them, in fact, pronounced him a genius. But the moment he got on the stage in front of an audience, nerves would take over. As it did so often in Sibelius's life. There's a letter where he says, when I'm trying to compose or when I try to play, I can only get through if I've got at least half a bottle of champagne inside me. And the same is true with my visits to my bank manager. So there's an awful lot of Dutch courage involved here, and clearly writing the Violin Concerto. Well, Sibelius had long since decided that he wasn't going to be a violinist and had taken to composing as the next best thing, unbelievably, considering what he did. And although he had put some distance between himself in 1903 when he wrote the concerto and the time when more than a decade ago he wanted to be a violinist, yet even so, it was still clearly painful. It still clearly hurt. And there is a sense of grappling with some sense of some maybe painful what might have been in this music. Is it the violin career, the love of the violin that he had to give up? Is it things to do with other loves or needs in his lives? It's very difficult to say, but this is music that comes from a very dark, passionate place. And yet it's so thrilling. It's so absolutely thrilling. And particularly in the last movement, there's a real sense of somehow or other Sibelius fighting his way through the storm, the snowstorm, if you like, and winning through. You can see the light and the hope at the end. It's very terse, it's very short. Finns are legendary for making the shortest goodbyes in humanity. They never like to linger over anything. They never use more words than they have to. And this ending is of a lot of Sibelius' symphonies can be surprisingly curt. He's not like Mahler, who likes to stretch it out. It's bye-bye. And it's very much the end of this case, at the end of the Violin Concerto. But there's a real sense that, in a way, he's won through something in this concerto. It's a kind of personal battle to come to terms with the fact that he's never going to be able to play this concerto. And yet, because he was so clearly such a good violinist, his identification with the instrument, his understanding of its capabilities is remarkable, and he asks it to do some pretty incredible things. So as well as being an important personal working through of something on a deep psychological level, it's also an incredibly brilliant concerto and very entertaining to watch as well as to listen to, as all concertos should be, I think. As for Prokofiev's Fifth Symphony, well, I know there have been one or two people recently saying, should we be performing works by iconic Russian composers at times like this? Well, my answer is yes, definitely. And particularly in the case of a work like Prokofiev's Fifth Symphony, partly because Prokofiev himself was born on what is now Ukrainian soil, and his mother had Ukrainian ancestry. And he always retained a particular fondness for that part of the world, but also because the Fifth Symphony was written at a time when the whole of the continent of Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe was under terrible threat from the Nazi invasion. In fact, the threat was beginning to diminish by the time that Prokofiev wrote the Fifth Symphony in 1944, because the Russians had turned the army round and were beginning to advance back through Eastern Europe towards Berlin. Prokofiev was horrified by the massive destruction. We have to remember that something like 20 million Russians lost their lives in World War II. It was unbelievably devastating. And cities like Stalingrad, as it was then known, were devastated in almost exactly the same way as is happening to certain of the Ukrainian cities now. But Prokofiev wanted to reaffirm hope, his belief in humanity. He wanted something that would stir, yes, maybe face some of what was going on, but remind everybody of what was worth fighting for, what it was that made human life, human society, human community so special. And this symphony really captures that remarkably in its big four-movement span. Prokofiev loves big tunes. I mean, even if you don't think you know any Prokofiev, you've probably heard him through things like the theme tune to The Apprentice, or the Lieutenant Quiget sleigh ride, which turns up still in carol sort of concoctions in supermarkets, even if people don't know what it is. Prokofiev was a wonderful melodist. And like a lot of Russians, he writes very long tunes. It has something to do with, I think, inhabiting such a huge, spacious country that you take deep breaths and sing big songs to try and fill as much of the space as possible. But in this symphony, it's tune after tune after tune, and yet at the same time woven into this magnificent piece of symphonic architecture. A symphony is a very special kind of drama, I think. In a way, it's a bit like a kind of novel in sound. It's a journey from A to B, and when you get to the end of the journey, you're in a different place from where you started, psychologically as well as maybe physically. And also the development of the themes that happens in a symphony is like the development of characters in a novel. You see them change by their experience and becoming something new. And it's marvelous that Prokofiev is able to do this so powerfully with so many of the wonderful themes in this brilliant, wonderful, warm, affirmative, and very, very colorful symphony. One just little detail you might like to look for, though, as you're watching, is that tuba players tend to get left out a bit in pieces. They tend to do their little bit every now and again to support the brass, and that's it on the bass level. But Prokofiev loves bass lines. An awful lot of his tunes, you'll discover, happen deep down in the bass. The opening one, for instance, rises out of the bass sounds. And the tuba gets to play an awful lot of these themes. Tubas love this symphony. So just have a look in the direction of the brass section from time to time, and you'll see the rare side of a tuba player, very active and enjoying himself. If it is a hymn, I think it is a hymn. Yes, the RLPO tuba player is a hymn. It's beautiful. But every other section of the orchestra gets a fabulous turn in the spotlight, so that it's almost a kind of concerto for orchestra as well. And the end has a tremendous, exhilarating sense of just life bursting out on every level. This is a symphony about, well, just the triumph of life. There's a little story, apparently, that when it was first performed in Moscow, the sound of artillery fire was heard not that far away as Prokofiev ascended the platform to conduct it. So he paused and waited until the artillery fire stopped before he started the symphony. This went down very well indeed. And the symphony was heard, I think, at the time as an indication of the people's will to survive. Okay, that was written for the Russians at a time when they had great need of it. But let's imagine, perhaps, as we listen to it, that the partly Ukrainian Prokofiev is also sending the same message out to his ancestor, the people of his ancestry too. That would be a rather nice thing to think, I think, under the current circumstances. Before that, Beethoven's Overture Leonore No. 3. I'd better explain the strange title. It's a kind of pub quiz. You could say, which opera exists in 3 versions and has 4 overtures? And the answer is Beethoven's Fidelio, which was originally known as Leonore. And Beethoven wrote 3 overtures for the Leonore version of the opera before finally deciding on something else for the final version. What was it that caused him such trouble? Well, the trouble is, he almost made the overture too interesting. You want an opera overture to set the scene, to get everybody in the right kind of mood for what's going to come. It's a curtain raiser. And you maybe introduce you to 1 or 2 of the tunes that you're going to hear in the course of the opera. But actually, what Beethoven creates here is something enormous and incredibly powerful and dramatic, so much so that it kind of tells the story of the opera before the opera's even begun. And that can create a very strange sense of, we might say, dramatic tautology. Once the opera starts, you've almost kind of heard what's going to happen, including the dramatic moment where the offstage trumpet pronounces the rescue. Rescue, I better tell you a little bit about the story. It's about a rescue from a prison of a political prisoner named Florestan by his wife, Fidelio. Her real name is Leonora, but she's dressed herself up as a boy to gain employment in the prison so that she can engineer the release of her husband, the rescue of her husband. And this she does fantastically. And at the last moment, when they're surrounded by the villainous, tyrannical Don Pizarro and about to face a grisly end, the trumpet sounds announcing that the governor, the state governor has arrived, and Don Pizarro knows it's all over and that Leonora there has won. It's actually a remarkably feminist opera for its time. Beethoven, in a way, was portraying the kind of woman he'd have loved to have had as his wife. Beethoven never married, alas. And what an impressive creature she is. Tremendous courage and determination, embodying the kind of love which you might say can pierce prison walls. And there's a great hymn to her at the end of the opera, but there is, in a sense, at the end of the overture too. This is, in a way, it's called an overture, but it's really much more like a tone poem. It's the whole opera boiled down into 15 minutes, 15 thrilling minutes, which just captivate what this extraordinary affirmative opera is about. Beethoven had amazing reserves of hope that withstood the collapse of the French Revolution and Napoleon Bonaparte's defeat, and also the loss of his own hearing, and the sight of Europe descending back into conservatism again after the defeat of Napoleon. And yet he carried on hoping, as works like the Ninth Symphony demonstrate so well. And this piece, I think, is one that embodies that triumph of hope. Never give up hoping. That seems to be the message of Leonore No. 3. And as such, I think it's rather a good introduction to a concert that ends with another work that says never give up hoping, Prokofiev's Fifth Symphony.